Good evening. How are you tonight? Small crowd, but that's fine. This will be a wonderful event. I know you're going to like our president. So, my name's John Ackerman, and I'm going to introduce the program today. Started off, I wanted to acknowledge, though, there was a large group of sponsors that got together to make this event happen. Of course, it was all 4 schools earlier today he went to. He also helped out with the press conference on the square. So it was plenty of events around town today, with this also as an addition. The group of sponsors that made this possible was Uftering's Auto Group, St. Patrick's Catholic School, myself, Tazewell County Board Member John Ackerman, Circuit Judge Candidate Kate Gorman, Matt LaHood, Washington District 50 Schools, Washington District 51 Schools, Washington District 52 Schools, the Washington Historical Society, State Senator Bill Brady, State Representative Keith Summers, Tazewell County Board Member Terry Hilligans, Tazewell County Board Member Mel Stanford, who's here this evening, Tom and Judy Gross, Judy's here, Circuit Judge Candidate Matt Hoppick, who is here in attendance, Tazewell County Board Candidate Andrew Reinhardt, who's here in attendance, Tazewell County Board Candidate John Redling Schaefer, who's here in attendance, Southside Bank, who has a representative here, Black and Brown Law Firms, and Courier Newspapers. So a large group of people coming together to make this event take place. I first want to introduce Judy Gross. Judy is Mrs. Lincoln this evening, is going to give an explanation about what the press conference on the square was all about concerning In Lincoln's Footsteps tourism campaign.
Thank you, John. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Lincoln and I have just had a wonderful day today in Washington, visiting all you fine folks. It was fun for me to see where he traveled many years ago from 1843 to 1858 as he rode the circuit to Metamora. I hadn't gotten a chance to visit here before, so it was fun for me. And the fine people in Washington, including the Historical Society and the Lincoln Bicentennial Committee and others, have made it possible to have bronze footsteps made just the size that Mr. Lincoln's feet are and boots, and they are going to be embedded in certain places around Washington. There's 5 sets of them. I'm just going to tell you briefly where they will be. 3 of them will be right on the square in Washington. 1 in front of the BP parking lot, Breckland's parking lot. There used to be a hotel there, later on known as the City Building, but one time in about 1858, Lincoln rode through on his way home from Metamora after speaking there, and the Republicans were all excited and grabbed him and convinced him that he should give a speech on the stairs of the hotel. So he did. He obliged them, and then quickly after that hopped on a freight train to Peoria and later to Galesburg, where he debated with Stephen Douglas. Another set will be in front of what is now Holland's Mercantile, and at that time was the Richard Smith dry goods store and was one of the original buildings in Washington during the time when my husband would have been going through here. Another one will be right in the square because he often rode by horseback, and so if he would have stopped in Washington, he would have tied his horses there on the square. Old Buck and Old Tom were 2 of his favorite horses' names. And then down the street a ways from Walnut Street, east of Washington, is the Presbyterian Church. There will be a set there because he made one of his first political speeches for Henry Clay and protective tariffs. Mr. Clay was one of my husband's idols when he first started giving speeches. Then the 5th set will be on North Elm Street, where there's a house that says Lincoln slept here. We're not sure that's true, but one of his friends, Haven Pierce, lived there, and he defended Mr. Pierce and the Washington boys in a trial. So there will be a brochure made that will explain where the footsteps are, what the stories are about, and that will be promoted hopefully in April or May of this year. We'll have the footsteps embedded in concrete when the weather gets better, and then we'll have that listed so people can go and see where Lincoln walked, and we'll hope you'll be there to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Lincoln, for joining us this evening. At each of the schools today, I picked a couple of our sponsors to introduce our Lincoln. So to do our introduction here, I'm going to have each of the sponsors that made an introduction at the school quickly give you a synopsis of what the message they sent to the students. And then when they're finished, they'll ask you to rise and we'll introduce our president. So with that, John Redling Schaefer, Andrew Reinhardt, Matt Hoppick, and Mel Stanford.
Good evening, everyone. I'm John Redling Schaefer.
I'm Andrew Reinhardt.
Matthew Hoppick. Bill Stanford.
And we all had the privilege at some point during the day of introducing the President of the United States, which is not something we get to do very often. I'm sure that Andy and I in particular were talking about it earlier. We're both practicing attorneys and very excited to partake and listen to our guest speaker because it's every day in our careers that we get to follow in those very footsteps of Lincoln. So we're very honored to be sponsors.
And I'd just like to add that both John and I are also candidates for the Tazewell County Board, and we'd appreciate your vote on March 20th this year. Thank you.
My name is Matthew Hoppick, and Lincoln is special to me because he made America a better nation. He was a man that was of strong faith, and because of the courage of his convictions and the commitment to those principles, he never wavered when other people did. And so because of that, he took us through a very troubled time in our country's history. And as I told the younger students, I don't want to misquote Abraham Lincoln because I am a practicing attorney as well. But as I recall, the quote is, it goes, "Always bear in mind that your own resolution to succeed is more important than any other." That's a lesson that I would encourage everyone watching, and especially the younger people, to keep in mind. Keep your faith in God, work hard, and know that perseverance pays. Do that, and who knows, maybe you can be the President of the United States as well.
Hi, I'm Mel Stanford, and Washington has a special place in my heart because it was in 1967, 45 years ago, that I stepped through the doorsteps of John L. Hensey to begin my career as a junior high social studies and history teacher. And one of the areas I always looked forward to teaching was this chapter on Lincoln. And it wasn't so much that he was a great man, it was the fact that Abraham Lincoln has so many ties to Central Illinois. And the other area that's so important is for our students to realize that Lincoln, because when Lincoln was a youth, Indiana and Illinois were the wild frontier. It was the wild, wild west. So he did not have much formal education because the school simply didn't exist. But he realized how important education was if he was to succeed, and he taught himself. And I hoped today that that message would be passed on to the students, that it is important that you work in school and that you study hard. The other thing I wanted to point out is we all know how great a man Lincoln was, and he still is. This is one of the better books, and I'm going to recommend a couple movies here for the kids too, that I've ever read by David Herbert Donald. But I saw him giving a presentation, and one of the things that he pointed out was that's so important about Abraham Lincoln, no matter where you go in the world, the one American that all people know about is Abraham Lincoln, because Abraham Lincoln fought for the rights of man. So if you get a chance to read this book, do it. It's about 15 years old. You can get it down at the museum. You see I have my Lincoln Museum sweatshirt on. The other thing is for the youth in here, and that I consider what I'm recommending to youth, anybody between about 9 and 90. If you haven't read it, read it. If you already read it, reread it. Abe Lincoln's Other Mother. It's really a great book. And then also, if you get a chance, you can see them on Turner Classic because I still watch them, but Abraham Lincoln in Illinois is one movie. That's with Raymond Massey. And then Young Mr. Lincoln with Henry Fonda. If you can do that, you'll get a real feel for what it was like in Illinois. And again, if you get a chance, plugging this book, but Lincoln by David Hubert Donald, get it right there, is really good, and Abe Lincoln's other mother. So thank you very much.
Mr. President.
Everybody wants to rise. Nice to meet you.
Thanks for coming back.
Mr. President, you want to head right up there?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Please be seated. Be seated. Well, it is a great pleasure for me to be here this evening, and I do wish to thank you for coming. I hope it's not expected that I'll be talking much about politics. Oh, good. I've long ago learned the more a man speaks on that subject, the less I understand him anyway. In fact, sometimes it seems like the more you say one thing, the more some people contend you really said just the opposite. So I resolved right up before anything else, no politics, not even political jokes. Sometimes political jokes get elected. Oh, I'll tell you, my friends, certainly nobody expected me to get elected. Nobody expected me to be president, least of all me. I think I could say, and I can say this without any mock modesty, I'm probably about the humblest individual to have ever been elevated to the office of the presidency. I have been called unqualified, unprepared, uncouth, unattractive, uneducated, most of which are probably true. Now, I actually, I've always been a Whig in politics, self-made man and all that. I've always preferred to think of it as self-educated. I referred to it once, well, it's here in Illinois, at the state convention, when I got the nomination. A fella come up to me afterward, he said, "Did I hear you say in there that you were a self-made man?" I said, "Yes, you did. What there is of me is pretty well self-made." He said, "Well, I think you did a poor job of it, son." And then he says, I wouldn't vote for you if you were St. Peter himself." I looked at him, I said, "Well, mister, if I were St. Peter, you probably wouldn't be in my district anyway." Oh, actually, being self-made is not entirely true. All that I am today, I hope to be over the next 4 years if I survive. I'd have to say, I owe to my angel mother. She died in my 10th year. And I can still remember her prayers for me. Always followed me. Clung to me all my life. Of course, now she wasn't a perfect woman. In fact, I'm told there's no such thing as a perfect woman. Let's be careful. We do have some ladies present tonight. But I heard it by good authority. It was a Methodist minister. Yeah, it was down southern Illinois. I'm sure it was Methodist. They're the only ones say such things. But I was down southern Illinois years ago. And I was attending divine service in this old Methodist church. I'm sure it was. Anyway, this preacher was carrying on and on about how there's no record in Scripture anywhere in all the history of a single perfect woman. There's only the Savior, and He was a man. Well, There's a little lady out there that morning. I think she rather objected to this sort of theology. she jumped up and starts shouting, "Parson, I beg to differ with you. I think there's at least one perfect woman in this tortured world, because I've been hearing about her nearly every day for the past 3 years." I don't think he was accustomed to this sort of interruption, especially from the gentler sex, so-called. Finally puts himself back together. He says, "Well, would you mind telling us all who that might have been?" She says, "Certainly. It was my husband's first wife." So I reckon there might be a few. Actually, my mother was my father's first wife. He married another woman. It was over a year after my mother's decease. She was just as good and kind a mother to me as my own. Just goes to show you, gentlemen, any woman will do well, as long as she's well done by. Those are precisely my feelings about this here country, friends. We're going to do well, as long as we're well done by. And this administration proposes to do precisely that over these next 4 years, in spite of this war. I'll tell you one thing, if these United States government ever be demoralized or overthrown, it's not going to come from partisan war or threats of continuation or secession or rebellion or assassination. None of those things. You know what's going to come from? Politics. Just plain old garden variety politics. This incessant desire to get yourself a political office, which really isn't anything more than a desire to get your work without doing any living. Get your living without doing any work. Some of them get their work without doing any living to boot. So I'm not free of that. I'll tell you, some days, if I'd known when I went to Washington what that first year would be like, I couldn't have imagined anyone living through it. I did, I think. But, and now with the re-election, office seekers, it's almost like a nightmare again. Sometimes the last thing I do before I pull my feet into the bed at night is look underneath, make sure there aren't some office seekers hiding under there, just hoping to have first go at me in the morning. In fact, when Ms. Lincoln and I took our leave, but actually she went on ahead, and I was supposed to catch a noon train, and then they postponed it till 2, so I took my lunch over at Willard's, and I went with Seward, and then I left my grip in the office, and I went back, and the office was filled. It wasn't even the office, the anteroom. I couldn't even get to the office to get my grip. It was filled with office seekers and political hopefuls, swarms of them, all hoping to have a minute with me before I left. And I cleared out the office with a story. In fact, I'll tell you what I told them. I said, gentlemen, this reminds me of something. I heard a story about a feller, he's a king, years ago. He's looking to fill an office, just one. Now, just a minute, let me tell you how the office got vacated. You see, apparently, he'd had a minister of state, highly educated feller, consulted even on personal matters with the king. One day, apparently, the king was desirous to go hunting. So, called his friends, and they got their guns and all, and then he called the feller and the minister and wanted to know what the day's weather would be. And the feller said, "It'll be a fine day for the hunt, my lord." So off they went. Well, it hadn't got too far down the road, and here down yonder around the bend comes an old countryman, just plain old country rustic, riding along in his jackass. And the king and the royal party kept on their way, and finally the feller come up and they was going to pass, and when he seen who they were and what they's about, of course immediately he dismounted and prostrates himself, you know how they do. And then just of a sudden, like an old popinjay, he perks up and says, "My lord, why surely you ain't a-going hunting today. It's going to rain." Well, the king, he'd already got the most educated opinion in the entire court. He didn't give it a second thought. He just kept on his way. Well, you know what's happening. Eventually, the clouds begun rolling in, and once the windows of heaven was opened, that was the end of the hunting party. So they go back, and he was fit to be tied. After he got himself dressed out again, he demands this fellow come in, the minister, of course, and he wanted an explanation. How was the most educated man in the entire court didn't know so much as his old countryman? Fell speechless. So the king dismissed him. Then he got to thinking, wonder how that feller did it. So they set up a search, just like for Cinderella's slipper. And they found him. They brought him in. And the king wanted to know, how was it that you told the wedding like that? Oh my, the feller, he was completely undone. He said, "Well, my lord, it weren't I. It were my jackass." The king says, "And how, pray, does the jackass tell the weather?" He says, "I don't reckon I know, my lord. But I'll tell you, if it's going to rain, she'll put her ears flat on back. And sure enough, it's going to be a good one. She put them right up." Well, king thought, sounds like a pretty good arrangement. Maybe he ought to see if he could procure this here jackass from the feller. And are you a married woman? But what does a jackass go for these days? Well, I mean, I was thinking maybe your husband told. Never mind. Never mind. We're probably $20. You think that'd probably do it? So he gives him the $20 piece. And the feller brought in the jackass. Let him in. And then he made the worst mistake ever. He put the jackass in the minister's position. And I told these fellas, you see, boys, ever after that, every jackass in the country's been looking for a political post. Cleared the office, that's for sure. Oh, my. I tell you. Presidency, even to the most experienced politician, is sure no bed of roses. If I'd even try to read, much less answer all the attacks and things I have to contend with, I think my office have to be closed for anything else. Even out there in Washington, I tell you, all the fine feathered folk out there, you know, some days I feel like the feller, he's out riding in the woods one day, and along coming, fine, genteel-looking woman. She's also on horseback, coming the other way. So he reins aside, let her pass, and as she drew nigh him, she looks up at him, and she stopped. She said, "Well, land sakes, you were the ugliest man I ever laid eyes upon." He looks back at her and he said, "Well, ma'am, I can't help that." She said, "Well, I suppose not, but you might stay home." It's just how I feel some days. I tell you, all the shortages of this war, there's never once been a shortage of folks that wish I just stayed home in Illinois. I was only 21 when I first got to Illinois. Passed my first year over in Macon County. Then I got to New Salem. Passed another year as sort of a clerk in a store. Then come the Black Hawk War. I joined up. In fact, you know, I was elected a captain of a volunteer company. Any of you men been in the service? You know, there's an election give me some satisfaction. I didn't know anything about war then. I remember my very first experience marching my company. We had a front line of, 20 men or so. We were marching through this field, and there's a fence over yonder with a gate. And we just kept marching. I couldn't for the life of me remember the proper word of command for getting my company turned endwise so I could pass them through the gate. So I said, "Company, halt!" "Company dismissed for 2 minutes, after which you file in again on the other side of that gate." Well, it wasn't proper military decorum, but it worked. Oh my. I went for the whole campaign. Actually, it was only 3 months. Never saw a single wild fighting Indian. Had some bloody struggles. Led some desperate charges across fields surrounded by wild onions. No Indians. I had some bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, though. I run for the legislature that year, lost. Only time I ever lost by direct vote of people. Now the next and 3 succeeding biennial elections, I served in the legislature down in Springfield. During that period, I studied law, actually, and finally removed to Springfield to practice it. So I was a Whig in politics, generally on Whig electoral tickets. I made active canvasses, but you know, the truth of it is, I was losing interest in politics in them days, practicing law more assiduously than ever. Is really the repeal of the Missouri Compromise. That's what aroused me to action again. I expect what I've done since then is pretty well known. You know, when I left Springfield for Washington, all thoughts were focused on the possibility of war. Everyone dreaded it. All, I think, sought to avert it. In fact, while my inaugural address was being delivered in Washington, devoted altogether to saving the Union without any war, there were already insurgent agents operating in the city, devoted altogether to destroying the Union without war, to just divide effects by negotiation, I expect. Both parties deprecated war. One would rather make war than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish. And the war came. Approximately 1/8 of the population were colored slaves, not distributed throughout the entirety of the Union, but located primarily in the southern part of it, and all knew that somehow that interest, that element was the cause for which these insurgents would rend the Union. And the government claimed no right other than to simply restrict the territorial enlargement of it. You know, I don't think either party anticipated that the cause of this struggle would cease with, even before the conflict itself has ceased. Each looked for an easier triumph and a result less fundamental and astounding. I should say, however, I mean, I'm naturally anti-slavery. I don't remember a time in my life when I did not so think and feel. To me, if slavery was not wrong, nothing is wrong. Whenever I appear before a body of citizens such as this, I look upon it as an opportunity to tell what I believe to be the essence of this struggle in which we are engaged. It is, on the one hand, or perhaps I should say, in part, a struggle to overthrow this government. And in another part, to overthrow the principle on which it is made. Now, that principle for which we struggle, apart from the military aspects of restoring the government, is the question upon which we have largely been tried. And as I said, I am naturally anti-slavery. I've always believed that all men everywhere ought to be free. What is freedom, though? There's moral freedom, political freedom. I think we could return to the definition which Mr. Jefferson gave us. I think a very good one, some 80-odd years ago, when he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Well, I think there's some honor due to Mr. Jefferson, who had the coolness and the forecast to instill in what was really a merely revolutionary document an eternal principle, an idea that is true for all men at all times: liberty. What is liberty? Well, you know, most of the world tonight is not free. I think that principle of freedom that Mr. Jefferson subscribed to us is, in fact, something which can be applied in all nations at all times. It's really nothing more than a political application of the Savior's ancient maxim to do for others the way you'd like to be done for yourself. Now, this is not the first country that ever attempted to be free, a democracy. You know, the Greeks attempted democracy years ago. If any of you happen to hear Dr. Everett's speech or read it at the cemetery at Gettysburg, he talked about how they only lasted some 70 years. Well, we've now surpassed them by 10. Some 80-odd years ago, we attempted to establish a democracy. What is a democracy? Well, I suppose in my estimation, this would be my definition. As I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. That is essentially my idea of a democracy. Now, whatever differs from that idea, I think to the extent of that difference, is no democracy. The Greeks didn't attempt to found their democracy on such ideas as the framers of this government. To found an idea on these ideas, a government on these ideas, was an astounding in the world. It had never been done. It was done on the assumption that civilized Christian men were enjoined to govern themselves, control themselves. I think a revolution was started then that became the hope of the world. Everywhere in the age of my grandfather, people looked to the example of America. The French tried it, the Hungarians tried it, the Italians tried it, the Germans tried it, but they failed. The French got Napoleon. The Italians ended up under tyranny. So did the Hungarians, and just only, not even 20 years ago, the Germans failed and were driven out of their country for attempting to establish a democracy. And now we find that the educated of the world look at the Enlightenment ideas of our grandfathers, of Mr. Jefferson and Mr. Washington, and they say, we know that those ideas are not true. All men are not created equal. Benjamin Disraeli stands up in the London Parliament and says, the great issue of the age today we know now is race. Scientists have discovered some races that are naturally inferior. And our American South has joined in the hue and cry. I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to read the great cornerstone speech of Alexander Stephens, the so-called vice president. But he says that Jefferson and Washington were wrong. The notion of equality was wrong, and that we are building a new, better, free white society on the great eternal principle that all men are not created equal, specifically the black men. And so they are trying to build a new government on the old principles of tyranny. I think most governments have been based, practically speaking, on the same thing, a denial of any equal rights. But ours began by affirming those rights. They said there's some people that are too ignorant, too vicious to have anything to do with government. And we said, well, possibly so, but by your system, you'll always keep them so, ignorant and vicious. And we proposed to give them all a chance. And we expected that we could grow stronger and the ignorant wiser, all would get happier and better together. I suppose I could say I truly love the sentiments of those old-time men. It became their idea of the economy of the universe. And it became a lofty, a wise, a noble understanding of the justice of the Creator to His creatures, to all of His creatures, to the whole great family of man. They believed nothing stamped with the divine image was sent into this world to be trodden on and brutalized by fellow creatures. And they grasped not just the race of men living then, but they reached forward and seized upon the farthest posterity. They erected a beacon to guide their children and their children's children, so that in future ages, when some man or some faction should set up their doctrine that none but this class or that class was entitled to liberty, that their posterity, my friends, you and I, could look up once again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle that our fathers began. Where I don't believe that any such embryo nation should ever be recognized in the great family of Christian nations. It is for that reason that I repeat the declaration I made a year ago, that while I remain in my position, I do not have any intention of retracting or modifying the Proclamation of Emancipation. If the people shall by whatever mode or means make it an executive duty, then I'm afraid they'll have to find some other to do it, not myself. And I do not attempt any compliment to my own wisdom or sagacity in saying these things. I frankly do not even claim to have controlled events. I'll confess to you, events have controlled me. Now, getting near to the end of this struggle, the nation's condition is not what either party or any man alone devised or expected. I suppose God alone could claim it. Isn't it interesting how in all struggles, each party claims to be acting in accordance with the will of God? Well, both may be, but I think one must be wrong. In this struggle, both parties read the same Bible, pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid against the other. The prayers of both could not be answered. That of neither has been answered fully. Well, it may be supposed before I conclude that I will say something regarding the progress of our arms, on which all else depends. I frankly think that since over the past 4 years, public pronouncements have been called forth on nearly every point and phase of the war, there's very little now that I can say that would be new to you. It's not as well known to you as it is to myself. But there is one thing that I think I can say with impunity, and that's because I was actually asked to say it. I was asked if I would repeat the remarks made at the dedication of the National Cemetery at Gettysburg. And so I will conclude with that, and if there are those of you who have questions you wish to tender, I'll do my best to answer. Dr. Everett's remarks were just amazingly well thought out, and I hope if you have an opportunity to read them that you will do so. I had only used these few words. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation, so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We've come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little, no, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Well, I wish to thank you for your time this evening, and I trust that we will all go forward from this place, perhaps with the lamp of liberty burning a little brighter in our own bosoms. And so if anybody has questions they wish to tender, I'll certainly do my best to answer them, and it doesn't have to be about politics or anything fine and highly feathered. You might just like to know how Tad's doing, or Fido. So I'll certainly, and if you're afraid to ask the first question, I'll take the second question first.
Lincoln was a great guy for you for educating yourself. What was something that you used?
A guide for educating myself. Well, we were taught reading, writing, and ciphering. And I figured as a boy, if I could read, write, and cipher, I'd have mastered them all. Of course, I found out there's an awful lot more to ciphering than just 2 + 2 = 4. But I labored assiduously to learn not just to read, but to understand. And you know, this is one thing that always drove me, and maybe it would be the principle that guided me too. When I hear folk telling things with great flowery language, I always, it just rankled me. It would make me angry when I was a boy. Keep me awake at night. I would pace back and forth in my little bedroom thinking, there must be some way to say that more clearly and simply with just one-syllable words. And I finally would get it. And that became a driving force. And then I had a law case down in Cincinnati one time, and I seen lawyers like I had never seen a lawyer and done. And I decided I was going to come back to Illinois and learn how to be a lawyer. You understand, I already had my license. So I took up the books of Euclid, and I discovered that if I could put my case, if I could demonstrate my case in such a way that the truth was incontrovertible, couldn't be gotten around or worked under, then I'd make a better lawyer. And that became a driving force in my life, to lay out my case clearly and succinctly and in such a way that men were driven to the conclusion without my ever having to raise my arm. And I reckon those are still both driving forces in my life. I look at when my first inaugural, when they were going to publish it, they tried to turn phrases and eliminate extraneous words and such, and I'd been very careful to put everything just so that it meant just what it meant and nothing other. You know, there's always someone's going to twist it and make it sound like it was meaning something else. There weren't many changes made. So, being succinct and clear and forceful, I reckon, in my thinking and my speaking. Well, anybody else? That takes care of the second question.
Why do you only serve one term in Congress?
Well, you know, we Whigs here in Illinois were always in the minority, as are the Republicans. Mr. Douglas did a pretty good job of building his party. And so we had a little arrangement among us. There were only really 3 prominent Whigs who could serve, who were qualified, and we determined that none of us would take a second term so that everybody got an opportunity before they was too old. So that was the agreement. And after one term, I I returned. It was hard, but you know, it was right after the Mexican War, and I never much agreed with the whole idea of taking Mexicans' land, and we were having a hard enough time managing our own land in those days. But it's just as well that I left while the getting was good. I made some statements while I was in Washington that not everybody agreed with. Yes, sir. How old was I when I became president? Well, you know, this is a little bit like getting married. See, you get engaged, and then you shake and tremble a while, then you get used to that part, and then you go up to the altar, and you're supposed to say, I do, and you shake and tremble a while there, too. See? Well, so I got elected when I was 51, but I wasn't quite president then. I was only president-elect. It's like getting engaged. You're not quite married, but you got one foot in the bathtub and the other on a banana peel. So then I had to go to Washington to get inaugurated, and I had my birthday day after I left. Yep. I had my birthday both in Indianapolis and Cincinnati. They even sung happy birthday to me in German. Yep. You know how to say happy birthday in German? Happy birthday in German. Anybody else? Well, we're going to have a wrestling match over here. We don't wrap things up pretty soon. Now, you boys know, when I was your age, I could lick anybody in a wrestling match. Can you?
Maybe.
Come here.
I can beat my cousin up.
Now, this is how we used to do it. Come here. Come up front so everybody can see me whoop you. All right. Take that there foot and put it forward. Now, this is what they call engine wrestling. And then you take hands like this, just like you're going to shake hands, nothing. And then the idea here is to get the other feller to move the back foot. Oh. So you try to get me to move this here foot, and I try to get you to move that other foot by pushing and pulling and tugging and struggling and things like that. And see, and I think it was a tie. So now that's fair wrestling. Anybody else? You've been a wonderful audience, and yes, sir. Oh, you're just scratching your nose. Yeah, don't do that in an auction. You might come home with something your wife don't want. All right. Well, you've been a very kind audience. I want to thank you very much. Good evening.